In their youth at the dawn of commercial aviation in the 1920s, airports were often distinctive places of excitement, opportunity and visitation, contributing to a growing culture of air-mindedness. By the end of the 20th century, they had transformed into an increasingly maligned aspect of modern culture. The design of airport lounges in particular seemed to sacrifice any sense of place in the name of mobility and the functionalities of air travel. The airport in the first age of affordable mass air travel from the 1960s seemed preeminently treated by all as a space of transit to be moved through as quickly as possible. They represented an homogenised built environment with universally look-alike architecture. They came to epitomise placelessness, and the narrative of this placeless airport often served to exemplify a wider discourse critical of the destructive worldwide spread of modernism through globalisation, erasing distinctive local flavours and replacing them with a sterile sameness of global corporate structures. The enhancement of security systems post 9/11 has further entrenched a syndrome of worldwide familiarisation, so too the airport as retail mall. Ted's initial formulation of placelessness in the mid-70s as a ubiquitous flatscape provided a ready-made characterisation for this notion of the placeless airport. Not only characterised by placelessness in terms of built form, but also in terms of facilitating the spread of placelessness through mass travel. Standardised planning where imaginative experience is substituted with maps and land use efficiency. A place where place, and I quote here from Ted, means little more than a location where certain specified interactions occur and certain limited functions are served. So they don't get a good rap in this book. In 1981, airports get linked to shopping malls as placeless, soulless megastructures driven by profit making. And I quote here from this book, international airports are a creation of the last 30 years bearing a certain topographical similarity to shopping malls. Built islands in a sea of concrete and Ted's favourite word of today, asphalt. Their visual and other qualities are both ahuman and anti-nature. They are machine landscapes of vast expanses of windswept, sun-baked concrete filled with ear-shattering noises, multi-storey parking lots covered in grime and automobiles, chain-link fences and buildings scaled to machines rather than people, all undergoing ceaseless reconstruction. Fairly damning word picture, that one. Right, indeed. Well, certainly circa... I've changed my view now. Certainly circa 1981, it could be spot on. It's not only the humane scale of airports which contributes to their placelessness that comes through this treatment in this book, but also being questioned, searched, crowded, herded, delayed, harassed, and so on. This critique carries through to Ted's third book, published in 1987. The airport is predominantly treated as a soulless, look-alike building devoid of any organic history of design and set within the subtopian suburban landscape. The reading of airports by Marc Auger a few years later is similar, although, as Ted himself indicated this morning, a little bit distinctive. Like other travelling spaces, such as freeways, the airport is an archetypal non-place in this treatment by virtue of individual behaviour being dictated by contractual obligations, predetermined codes and instructions. This book by Gottdiener alludes to Ted's notion of placelessness. It's published in 2001. Gottdiener says nowhere architecture of airports seem the same just about everywhere. But in this treatment, a quarter of a century after Place and Placelessness is published, there's a greater acknowledgement of the changing nature of the airport in the late 20th century. Gottdiener captures their transformation to multifunctional platforms whose scale and dynamism, gravity as economic growth poles with large labour forces, has them resembling mini-cities. Gottdiener identifies elements of place in the new airport landscape, with some of the best airports, he says, places in their own right, allowing people to enjoy, relax, interact within a positive environment. So there's a diversity being realised here, a duality. And I quote Gottdiener, airports are a new kind of space that provides portals to the realms of both place and placelessness. So I think this is sort of picking up the tension that Ted identified between place and placelessness in his opening address, and which is, I think, emerged as a bit of a theme in subsequent presentations, and it informs this presentation. The arrival of more nuanced interpretations of airport spaces has been really consolidated since the early 2000s by the so-called mobility turn in the social sciences. This literature has many different perspectives, but there are some common threads that can be extracted. Airports become microcosms of wider urban forms. The literature challenges the notion that they are simply nodes in a network. It highlights them as places where human mobility flows interconnect. Creswell, quoted several times today, says that Schiphol, for example, the airport in Amsterdam, may be a node in a global space of flows, but it's still uniquely Schiphol. It's still a place. Alain de Botton's 2009 diary of his week-long stay in Heathrow captures, can you imagine, captures the richness, nevertheless, rather than the sterility of a global hub airport. It's sort of this intertwining of globalisation, aero-mobility, inevitably producing varied and hybrid outcomes. Globalisation drives competitive branding and differentiating impulses at the same time as it engenders uniformity and sameness. The tension, the duality, the contradiction, the paradox. As John Short has said, global cities, like their airports, are all very different, yet the same. So it's this dialogue between, I think, uniqueness and sameness. The changing of nature of airports makes them more interesting places. The concept of the airport city is helpful here because it captures the diversification of land use and placemaking potentialities at airports. To some extent, Ted's work helps reinforce the enduring stereotype, up until this morning at least, the enduring stereotype of the placeless airport. But the nature of aviation and airports has changed fundamentally since the 1970s. They have been transformed in design, in fit-out, and in precinctual terms. We've got examples of that. With connotations of place. Denver Airport, designed by Fentress architects, with its terminal building evoking the peaks of the nearby Rockies as much as the peaks of the Native American teepees that once were on this land. Inside the terminal, innovation in wayfinding here at Vienna Airport, where the characters and symbols on the signs are all slightly blurred, less crisp than usual. And the designer in a recent New York Times article says, my job was to create a system of signs that makes the airport a place and not a non-place. Amsterdam Airport, with a branch of the city's museum. Wellington Airport, with a giant golem from Lord of the Rings, constructed by director Peter Jackson's nearby local Weta workshop. And even smaller airports are getting into the act. In the Pilbara, Port Hedland's International Airport, by virtue of one weekly flight to Bali, to take to give miners a break from the fly-in, fly-out, is a very recent example of this, polling travellers on what they might want. Outside of terminals, in the wider aviation precinct, there have been dramatic changes as land surplus to core requirements has been transformed for a variety of new functions, often seemingly unrelated to the core business of planes taking off and landing. So this is the notion of the placeful airport, which is coined in our paper's title, which might not last into a book chapter, but seemed like a good idea at the time. The trend is delivering theme parks, retail malls, unexceptional and placeless in the bigger scheme of things, but it's also generating a range of more interesting responses as well. This so-called landside development is of most interest to Ilan and myself in this paper. It's here we see explicit connections being made between airports, urban design, placemaking and the public realm, stitched together usually through master planning processes. Three brief examples to effectively close my presentation, even before it's got going. Through Canberra, Essendon and Auckland airports. In Canberra, the emphasis has been on creating a walkable set of interlinked public spaces within a slightly edgier interpretation of the sort of dominant pastoral capitalist design of the modern office park. This mostly the work of the architects Darryl Jackson and Alastair Swain, who was appointed ACT government architect in 2010. Doesn't quite obviously speak to an airport environment. Water features, there's also a tri-generation plant here in Australia's first 5-star green rated commercial building. And featured throughout the business park are the figurative sculptures of the Croatian-born sculptor Ante Dubrow. At Essendon Airport, which was Melbourne's main airport until Tullamarine opened in the 1970s, the emphasis has been on heritage conservation, driven by Commonwealth and state controls. And so there is much interesting and innovative and quite handsome adaptive reuse going on here. This is a building by distinguished mid-century modernist Arthur Baldwinson. Old hangars and offices which lay derelict for some years after the new airport opened 10 kilometres up the road have recently been done up and leased commercially. And interpretive signage is moving in for visitors as much as for travellers. Finally, at Auckland, we've got, I think, arguably the best example in our region of an urban design-led revitalisation process. The scope here is ambitious and there's a long way to go, and there are still acres of dreary asphalt car parks and internal connectivity is poor. But there have been real gains as well. The quad is in red is the main commercial core. The green marks the common, which is a large public space. At the entrance to Auckland Airport, there are massive dune mounds up to 9 metres high, providing an entry statement intended to link back to ancient landscapes which greeted the Maori and European migrants in previous centuries. So this done by the San Francisco landscape architect James Lord. There has been a conscious attempt to break away from campus-style commercial areas to fashion a kind of downtown urbanism. Running off the main street, just shown is the public art walk leading into that big splash of green, the common, with a stormwater pond doubling as a picturesque lake, and in the distance heritage buildings which are adapted as a boutique conference complex. So all kind of interesting spaces that have some degree of meaning in their own right, that break away from those stereotype views of airports, I think, that were formulated in the 1970s. Nevertheless, we've still got spaces like this. This is Adelaide Airport and the wall of a discount factory outlet. And you see this and you think of Geoffrey Smart. This is Geoffrey Smart's 1975 painting of the Rome airport car park. Nevertheless, despite that reinforcement of the stereotype, this paper is arguing that airports, both inside the terminal and outside in the precincts that they occupy, are receiving major makeovers and have done really since the late 20th century, with terminals being infused with local identity and symbolism, and surrounding development being made more interpretable, navigable and welcoming through urban design initiatives. The ultimate goal, I think, is basically value uplift in commercial investment. We don't need to be ambiguous about that, but in the process I think there have been some positive outcomes. We can see that in Essendon with sort of quiet places to make sense of the space overall. We can see it in Canberra with the mix of old and new in the Fairbairn precinct, nicely evoking the sort of traditional bush capital flavour of Canberra in the 1950s. And finally in Auckland with an un-airport-like landscape. So to conclude, through the diversification of land uses, attention to the public realm and distinctive placemaking strategies using design and storytelling techniques, the experience of travelling, working or visiting in contemporary airports and airport cities has changed in profound ways. Ted himself conceded in a paper that he wrote in Progress in Human Geography in 2000 that the stark definitions and understandings of the 1970s have become blurred, and that today each place has to be assessed carefully and on its own terms. And I think that commentary came through tacitly in his presentation this morning. So in our view, this sort of placefulness of the modern airport makes them ripe for further critical attention. So thank you.